November 9th, 1943. A foxhole. Two men. An island in the Pacific most Americans have never heard of. The younger of the two was 21 years old, 3 days past his birthday. He'd been lying in that hole for hours, listening, not to anything in particular, to the dark, to the sound of grenades falling closer with each pass. At some point during the night, he said 3 words to the man beside him. "I'll take it." He wasn't talking about a job. He wasn't answering a question anyone had asked. He had looked at the weapons they were carrying, looked at the situation they were in, done the kind of math that most men spend their whole lives hoping they never have to do. And he had told the man beside him what he had already decided. "I'll take it." Nobody ordered him to say that. Nobody asked. He wasn't the only one. 8 days before that conversation, on the same island, a man from South Carolina had stood up on a beach while a gun was killing the men around him, and walked straight toward it. 6 days after that, in the jungle a few miles inland, a man from West Virginia had thrown a grenade and hadn't moved when it came back. 3 men. 8 days. None of them knew the other 2 existed. This is their story. By the fall of 1943, the United States had been fighting Japan for nearly 2 years. Guadalcanal had been won, at enormous cost. The Japanese had been pushed back, one island at a time, across the Solomons chain. The supply lines were shifting. The momentum was shifting. But Rabaul still stood. On the northeastern tip of New Britain, the Japanese had built the most powerful military base in the entire Pacific. 100,000 troops, 5 airfields, a harbor deep enough for a fleet. From Rabaul, Japan could threaten everything south of New Guinea. Every American ship, every convoy, every transport that came within range did so at risk. The American commanders understood the problem clearly. Rabaul could not be taken by force, not without a cost in men and ships that nobody was willing to pay, and not with the resources available in late 1943. A frontal assault was out of the question, but it could be strangled. If American aircraft could fly regular missions over Rabaul, hitting the airfields, mining the harbor, cutting the supply lines, the base would wither on its own. It wouldn't need to be taken. It just needed to be made useless. To do that, the Americans needed an airfield within striking range. They needed flat ground, somewhere in the islands to the south. Somewhere engineers could pour concrete, and carpenters could build a runway, and fighter pilots could take off and be over Rabaul before they ran low on fuel. They found it on Bougainville. Bougainville is the largest island in the Solomon chain, 60 miles wide in places, covered almost entirely in jungle so dense that a man could get lost 20 yards from the trail he'd just left. The Japanese knew it mattered. They had 40,000 troops on the island. The bulk of those forces were concentrated at the northern and southern ends, around Buka in the north, around Buin in the south. The middle of the island, a stretch of swampy coastline along Empress Augusta Bay, was held by a much smaller garrison. That was the opening. Admiral Halsey's plan was straightforward in concept and brutal in the details. Land at Cape Torokina, right in the middle of the island's western coast, where the Japanese were thinnest on the ground. Establish a beachhead. Build an airfield as fast as possible. Then let the aircraft do the work. The resources were thin. There was one carrier group available for air cover, and it couldn't stay indefinitely. Once the Marines were ashore, they would be largely on their own. Each man was issued 1 unit of fire, 1 combat load of ammunition, enough for 1 fight, not more. The men who would make that landing belonged to the 3rd Marine Division. They had been formed just over a year earlier, in September 1942, at Camp Elliott outside San Diego. The division was built from scratch. Cadre officers, freshly trained enlisted men, a handful of veterans mixed in among thousands who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Most of the men in the division had never been in combat. They trained in New Zealand through the Southern Hemisphere winter of 1943, then moved to Guadalcanal to absorb what the veterans there had learned. What the Guadalcanal veterans had learned was not the kind of thing that transferred easily in a classroom. It was the kind of thing you either knew from being there or you didn't know at all. They tried to pass it on anyway: how to move through jungle without sound, how to read the ground when the ground was trying to kill you, how the Japanese fought at night, and what they did when they thought they had you surrounded, and what they did when they didn't. The 3rd Marine Division listened and took notes and ran exercises in the heat and tried to be ready. Nobody was ever really ready. On the night of October 31st, the convoy moved through Empress Augusta Bay without running lights. The waters were calm. The men aboard the transports were awake long before dawn. Some ate. Most didn't. The men who had been through this before, who had climbed into boats before, who had gone in on beaches before, sat quietly with whatever they had learned to do with the hours before something started. The men who hadn't been through it sat quietly too, because there was nothing useful to say, and they knew it, and because saying something just to fill the quiet felt wrong. On one ship, a sergeant from Spartanburg, South Carolina, sat with his tray in the dark and didn't have much to say. There was nothing left to say. Tomorrow was coming whether he talked about it or not. At 0500 on the morning of November 1st, the ship went to general quarters. At 0637, the destroyers began shelling the shoreline. At 0710, the ramps dropped. The men of the 3rd Marine Division stepped off into the water, and the gun opened up. Nobody on those landing craft could see where it was coming from. What they could see was the result. A boat would be moving toward the beach, and then it wouldn't be. Landing craft went down. Others were torn up badly enough that they couldn't make it back. The men in the water had nowhere to go. Rifle fire couldn't reach the gun. Grenades fell short. The beach at Cape Torokina was narrow, dense jungle pressing right to the waterline on both sides. No angle to flank, no ground to work with. The men who had reached the sand were flat in the black volcanic sand, heads down, the gun somewhere in the tree line, and nobody able to get eyes on it without drawing a burst. Every man who raised his head got shot at. The battalion commander, Major Mason, was moving forward, trying to push his men off the beach when he took a wound. Before they carried him back, he turned toward the men still pinned down in the sand. "Get the hell in and fight." They carried him off the beach a few minutes later. The gun kept firing. Robert Allen Owens was born in Greenville, South Carolina, in 1920. His family moved to Spartanburg when he was still small. He left school after his 2nd year of high school, not because he had somewhere better to be, but because there were bills that needed paying, and he was old enough to help pay them. For 5 years after that, he worked the looms at a mill in one of the towns nearby. Early mornings, long shifts, the kind of work that doesn't make the news. He enlisted in February 1942, a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. He went through boot camp at Parris Island, infantry school at New River, North Carolina. Then the division shipped to New Zealand, then to Guadalcanal for training, not to fight, but to learn from men who had. By November 1943, Owens had been in uniform for nearly 2 years. He had never fired a shot at anyone. There was nothing in his service record that set him apart from the men around him. No combat experience, no special schools. He was a sergeant, 23 years old, and November 1st, 1943 was his first day in a fight. The gun that was killing his men was a 75mm artillery piece, set into a bunker built from coconut logs and packed earth, dug flush into the tree line at the edge of the beach. It had been positioned carefully. On either side of the main gun, smaller positions provided covering fire, each one protecting the other, each one protecting the 75. Any approach from the left flank would walk into crossfire from the right. Any approach from the right would walk into crossfire from the left. The only open angle was directly in front, straight down the barrel. For more than an hour, the Marines on that beach hadn't moved. 40 yards of sand at most before the jungle started. Nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to regroup. Those who had reached the sand were packed into that strip of ground, face down, close enough to the gun to hear it fire, but unable to get close enough to do anything about it. Every attempt to suppress it with rifles fell short. Grenades couldn't reach. Owens had been watching the muzzle flash for most of that hour. He had been thinking about what happened if nobody did anything. The rest of the landing force was still on those boats. The beach had to be cleared. The gun had to stop. And there was only one direction to go. Straight at it, through the open ground in front of the bunker, while the gun was still firing. He called for 4 volunteers. He placed them on the flanks, 2 to each side, with orders to draw fire from the smaller positions, to keep those gunners occupied, to give him 30 seconds of their attention pointed somewhere other than straight ahead. Then he went for the main gun himself. What happened next was put on record by the men who saw it. Owens crossed the open ground in front of the bunker under fire. He didn't sprint. The accounts say nothing about a sprint. He moved toward the emplacement across open sand, under fire, while the gun was still operating. He reached the bunker. He entered through the firing port, the narrow slot cut into the front face of the structure, the same opening the crew used to aim and shoot. From the front, while the gun crew was still inside. Inside, a round already chambered. 150 rounds of high-explosive ammunition stacked beside the crew. He drove the crew out through the rear exit. His men were waiting on the other side. The gun went silent. Owens came out through the rear after them, and then he went down. He died of his wounds on the beach at Cape Torokina. He had been in uniform since February 1942. He had never fired a shot at anyone until that morning. General Alan Turnage, commanding the 3rd Marine Division, would write afterward that among all the acts of courage on that beachhead, no single action saved more lives or contributed more to the success of the landing than what Robert Owens did on the morning of November 1st. The rest of the landing force came ashore. They crossed the beach he had cleared. Most of them never knew his name. He is buried at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines. He was a mill worker from Spartanburg, 23 years old. If you've never heard his name before today, hit subscribe, because there are 2 more men on this island you need to know about. And history forgot all 3 of them. 6 days later, inland from the beach, a few miles into the jungle, the air smelled of wet rot and something burning. A football player from West Virginia was leading his men toward a Japanese machine gun. Herbert Joseph Thomas, Jr. was born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1918. His family moved to South Charleston, West Virginia, when he was 7. He grew up there, went to the local schools, played halfback for South Charleston High, did well enough that after graduation he spent a year at Greenbrier Military School before earning a full athletic scholarship to Virginia Tech. By his senior year, he led every college football player in the state of Virginia in scoring. His mother had died when he was 13. That is the kind of loss that either makes a person or doesn't. For Thomas, it hadn't stopped him. He had kept going, one thing at a time, until the one thing in front of him was a diploma 2 months away. He left before he got it. His friends were joining the Marines, and Herbert Thomas was not the kind of man who stayed behind while the people he cared about went somewhere dangerous. He went into the Army Air Corps first, spent several months there, then put in for a transfer to the Marines because that's where his friends were. And that was reason enough. That transfer put him on Bougainville on the morning of November 7th, 1943. But he had been on the island for 6 days before that morning. He came ashore on November 1st with the rest of the 3rd Marines in the same waves that were being torn apart by the 75mm gun at Cape Torokina. His unit landed east of the Cape. He made it up the beach. He dug in. For the first several days, the work was not combat. It was the grinding, unglamorous labor of turning a strip of sand and jungle into something that could hold. His regiment pushed inland, cutting trails through growth so dense that the men in front were invisible to the men 10 yards behind. They built defensive positions. They ran patrols. They found Japanese stragglers and dealt with them. They learned the ground. On the night of November 6th, word came down through the lines that Japanese troops had landed to the south, at Torokina Lagoon, 6 miles from the perimeter. A counterattack was coming. Thomas and his men moved out before dawn. The jungle on Bougainville was not like anything they had prepared for. Marines who had come through Guadalcanal said the terrain here was worse. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, the ground below was in near darkness. The trees grew close enough together that a man could lose sight of the man beside him after 10 steps. The ground underfoot was either hard coral rock or ankle-deep mud, sometimes one then the other, within the same 20 yards. Sound traveled strangely. A machine gun firing 50 yards off could seem to come from any direction. Thomas moved through it anyway. He found the first Japanese machine gun position by watching for the muzzle flash through the undergrowth. He moved his men into position around it, 2 to suppress from the left, 2 from the right, and went for it with grenades. It stopped firing. He found the second position dug into the root system of a large tree, the roots providing cover on 3 sides. It took him nearly 20 minutes to find an angle that wasn't covered. He got close enough and used grenades again. That one went silent, too. He kept moving. The third position was in tighter ground. The machine gun sat behind a low rise, with a creek bed dropping away on the left, and a wall of wait-a-while vines on the right, the kind with small curved thorns that caught clothing and skin and wouldn't let go. There was no clean approach from either flank. Thomas looked at it for a moment. His men were behind him, waiting in the cover. He had used the same tactic twice already that morning, and twice it had worked. Throw a grenade into the emplacement, rush it the moment the grenade went off. It was the right call. There was no reason to think the terrain had changed enough to make it wrong. He pulled the grenade. He threw it. It hit a vine in the canopy and came straight back down into the middle of his men. There was no time to warn anyone. There was no time for anything. Thomas dropped onto the grenade. He was 25 years old. His men stood up. They went for the machine gun position, exactly as Thomas had told them to, exactly as he had planned. They took it. The man who made the plan was gone. The plan had not gone with him. Herbert Thomas was the first man from West Virginia to receive the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. In 1945, his sister Audrey put her name to the christening of the destroyer USS Herbert J. Thomas. She broke the bottle herself. In 1946, the city of South Charleston opened a new hospital and named it after him. Virginia Tech named a dormitory in his honor. It stood for decades. He had been a halfback, a scholarship athlete, a man who transferred from one branch of the military to another because his friends were there, and he couldn't think of a good reason to be anywhere else. He made a choice, walked through a door. The door closed behind him. 2 days later, along the Piva Trail, in the dark before dawn, 2 Marines shared a foxhole. Henry Gurke was born on November 6, 1922, in Nietzsche, North Dakota. 1 mile north of Nietzsche is the Canadian border. The nearest city of any size is nearly 90 miles away. His parents, Julius and Hulda, had come from Ukraine, passed through Winnipeg, and settled in the far northeast corner of North Dakota, at a time when the land was still cheap and the work was hard. Julius Gurke was a carpenter. He spoke German at home. Henry was the 5th of 8 children. He enlisted in Minneapolis on April 15, 1942, at the age of 19. Boot camp at San Diego. Then the New Hebrides. Then Guadalcanal. then Bougainville. On the night of November 9th, 1943, 3 days after his 21st birthday, he was lying in a two-man foxhole along the Piva Trail with a Marine named Donald Probst. The Piva Trail ran through the interior of the island, south from the beachhead. Whoever held it controlled the main approach to Cape Torokina from the south. The Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment had been pushing down it for days, trying to break through the Marine roadblock before the Americans could consolidate their position and bring up heavier weapons. The Marines holding that roadblock had been in contact since November 6th. 3 days of fighting in terrain that made movement almost impossible. The jungle on both sides of the trail too dense for units to stay in contact if they spread out more than a few yards. Reinforcement meaning single file down an exposed path. Resupply meaning the same. By the night of November 8th, the Japanese were probing more frequently. The grenades were coming in closer. Earlier that night, the two Marines in the foxhole directly beside Gurke and Probst had been killed in the first minutes of one of those probes. Their position was empty. Gurke and Probst were the only ones left holding that section of the line. If they gave way, the entire left flank of the roadblock opened up. They held. Donald Probst was from Seattle, Washington. He carried a BAR, a Browning automatic rifle, belt-fed, capable of sustained automatic fire that a submachine gun couldn't match. In a two-man foxhole, under grenade attack, in the dark, the BAR was the more valuable weapon by a wide margin. Gurke had the submachine gun. During a lull in the firing, the two men talked. It was not a long conversation. They looked at their weapons, and they looked at the situation, and the situation was not complicated. The Japanese were not going to stop. The grenades were going to keep coming closer. At some point, one was going to land in the hole. They agreed. If that happened, the bar needed to keep firing, which meant Probst needed to keep firing. Then Gurke said something that a lieutenant positioned nearby would write down afterward. "If a grenade drops into this hole," he told Probst, "don't worry about it. I'll take it." It was not a dramatic thing to say. There was nothing in his voice, as it was later described, that made it sound like anything other than what it was. A plan. The conversation ended. They went back to watching the dark. The night continued. The Japanese came again before dawn. The grenades came with them, more of them landing closer, probing for the position. One dropped straight into the foxhole. Gurke shoved Probst aside, hard, no time to be gentle about it, and covered the grenade with his body. Probst was wounded in the blast. He got back to his feet. He got back behind the BAR. What happened in the minutes after that is what earned him the Silver Star. Not the act of surviving, but what he did with it. The position he and Gurke had been holding was still the only thing standing between the Japanese and the left flank of the roadblock. The men who had been killed in the foxhole beside them were still dead. Nothing about the tactical situation had changed, except that Gurke was gone. Probst kept firing. The Japanese came again, probing the position, trying to find the gap they expected to be there. Probst was alone now, bleeding, working the BAR through what was left of the night. He kept them back. When other Marines finally reached the position at first light, they found him still there, still holding. He was later evacuated for his wounds. He was later awarded the Silver Star for what he did in the minutes and hours after Henry Gurke died. Henry Gurke is buried at Neech Union Cemetery in Neech, North Dakota. The town of 500 people, 1 mile from the Canadian border, where his father built things out of wood and spoke German at home. His mother, Hulda, put her name to the christening of the destroyer USS Gurke in 1945. He was 21 years old and 3 days when he died. He did not act because he had no time to think. He had thought it through the night before. He had made his decision in the quiet, and when the grenade fell, all he did was keep his word. 3 men, 8 days, 1 island. Robert Owens died on November 1st. Herbert Thomas died on November 7th. Henry Gurke died on November 9th. They never crossed paths. They were operating in different parts of the same beachhead, in different units, on different ground, against different objectives. There was no meeting, no shared moment, no point at which their lives touched. Each man made his decision alone, with only the men immediately around him. The Japanese had a well-constructed plan for Bougainville. General Imamura at Rabaul had estimated the American landing force at somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 men. Several hundred Japanese soldiers came ashore at Torokina Lagoon on the night of November 6th, the first move of a counterattack designed to cut the beachhead in half before the Americans could entrench. Vandegrift's full landing force numbered over 14,000 men, and they were coming, wave after wave, regardless of what was waiting on that beach. But numbers were not why the Japanese failed at Cape Torokina. Their plan was reasonable. Their execution was serious. They failed because the plan did not account for a mill worker who would enter a loaded artillery piece through the front, or a football player who would use his body to absorb a mistake, or a carpenter's son who had already made up his mind the night before. They kept trying. General Hyakutake, commanding the Japanese 17th Army on Bougainville, spent the winter of 1943 to 1944 preparing. He moved artillery onto the ridges overlooking the American perimeter, piece by piece, dragged through jungle by hand, positioned to cover the airstrips and the supply dumps. He concentrated 12,000 infantry from the 6th Division, plus 3,000 reserves. He was methodical about it. He planned the attack for March, when his forces would be ready, and the Americans, he believed, would be complacent. He planned on accepting Griswold's surrender at the Torokina airstrip on March 17th. On March 9th, 1944, Hyakutake opened his assault. His artillery hit first, the heaviest concentration of Japanese field guns assembled in one place up to that point in the Pacific. The shells fell on the airstrips, and the supply dumps, and the defensive perimeter. Then 15,000 Japanese infantry went forward on 3 axes, driving toward the center of the American lines. They fought hard. The 37th Infantry Division and the Americal Division, Army units that had replaced the Marines on the perimeter, held, then counterattacked. Hill 700 fell and was retaken. Cannon Hill fell and was retaken. By the end of March, Hyakutake's assault was broken. More than 5,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. It failed, because by then, the airfields were built. The Seabees had started work on the fighter strip while Marines were still in contact on the perimeter. They worked in shifts around the clock, in rain that turned the construction site into a mud flat, under intermittent shelling from the hills to the east. They filled craters as fast as they appeared. They poured concrete for the taxiways with snipers still active in the tree line 200 yards out. On December 10th, 1943, 39 days after the landing, the first Corsairs taxied onto the finished strip and took off. The pilots in those aircraft knew what was below them. They had been briefed on the landing, on the casualties, on what it had cost to hold the perimeter long enough to build the runway they had just rolled down. Some of them had flown air cover during the landings themselves, watching from above as the Higgins boats went down, and the men in the water had nowhere to go. Now they were flying north, over the beach at Cape Torokina, over the tree line where the 75mm gun had sat, over the ground where Robert Owens had crossed open sand with a loaded artillery piece waiting for him at the other end. Rabaul was just over an hour away. A second airstrip opened on Christmas Day. By January 1944, American bombers were running daily missions over Rabaul. The airfields there were bombed and rebombed. The harbor was mined. the supply ships stopped coming. By March 1944, Rabaul was finished as a fighting base. 100,000 Japanese troops remained on the island, sitting, unable to move, unable to resupply, watching American aircraft fly over them for the rest of the war. Admiral Halsey sent a message to the Marines when the first airfield was complete. "You have literally succeeded in setting up and opening for business a shop in the Japs' front yard." 3 destroyers carried the names of 3 men who didn't live to see any of it. USS Robert A. Owens, launched 1946. She served the United States Navy for 36 years. USS Herbert J. Thomas, launched 1945. His sister Audrey broke the bottle at the christening. USS Gurke, launched 1945. His mother Hulda broke the bottle. They sailed the same oceans for decades. They never sailed together. Owens Thomas Gurke, a mill worker, a football player, a carpenter's son, Spartanburg, South Charleston, Nesh. None of them were born to do what they did. None of them woke up that morning with anything in mind beyond getting through the day. Owens saw a gun that was killing the men around him and understood there was one way to stop it. Thomas threw a grenade and didn't move when it came back. Gurke made a decision the night before, told the man beside him what it was, and kept it. There is no formula for that. There is no training program that produces it on schedule, no background that guarantees it, no particular town or family or circumstance that explains it. They were ordinary Americans, the most ordinary kind this country has ever had. Until they weren't. The men who came ashore after Owens, the men who moved through the jungle after Thomas and Gurke, most of them never learned those names. That is how it works. You don't stop to find out who cleared the ground you're standing on. You move forward. You do the next thing. You try to make it home. Some of them did. They came back to places like Spartanburg and South Charleston and small towns in North Dakota and Pennsylvania and Ohio. They came back to wives who had been working in factories and raising children and trying not to read too much into the telegrams that sometimes came. They came back to parents who had kept the photographs on the mantel and said prayers at night and tried not to think about what the casualty lists in the newspaper meant. Some of them came back changed in ways that didn't have words yet. The words would come later, years later, decades later. But in 1945 and 1946, there were no words. There was just a man sitting at a dinner table who had been somewhere and seen something and done something, and the family around him who loved him and didn't ask too many questions because something in his face told them not to. Years passed. Some of them sat at those dinner tables for decades without saying much about any of it, not because there was nothing to say, but because some things happened in a particular darkness, on a particular piece of ground, that lose something when you try to put them into words for someone who wasn't there. You can say what happened. You can't always say what it was. Their grandchildren grew up. They saw the photographs. They asked questions sometimes and got answers sometimes, and sometimes got something else. A pause, a change of subject, a hand on a shoulder. These 3 men. This is what was on the other side of that. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, if he came home and sat at that table, and you never quite knew what he'd seen, leave his name in the comments. Where he served. That's all. Pearl Harbor. Morning, December 31st, 1941. A submarine sits low in the water near the dock. Not by choice. By necessity. The USS Arizona is 27 feet below the surface of the harbor. Oklahoma has capsized and hasn't been righted. West Virginia, California, Nevada, sunk or beached in the 24 hours that ended on a Sunday morning 3 weeks ago. There is no undamaged battleship available at Pearl Harbor to host a change of command ceremony for the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. So they use a submarine. The officers standing on the deck of USS Grayling that morning know exactly what the fleet looks like now. 3 carriers somewhere at sea, a handful of cruisers, a submarine force that hasn't fired a single torpedo in anger against the Navy that did this. Among those officers is a man who has already assumed he is finished, not because he was told to leave, because he understands the rules. His name is Edwin Layton. His rank is commander. His title, Fleet Intelligence Officer of the United States Pacific Fleet. His job, every single day for the past year, was to know what the enemy was going to do before they did it. On December 7th, he didn't know. In the U.S. Navy, when a commander is relieved, his staff goes with him. Layton understood that. He didn't argue it. He had already requested transfer to Destroyer Command. The kind of thing a man does when he's trying to stay useful and get out of someone else's way at the same time. He was waiting for the answer when the new commander arrived. 6 days earlier, on Christmas morning, a 4-engine flying boat had appeared out of rain and low clouds over East Loch and touched down on the water. The man who stepped out wore civilian clothes. The president had ordered him to travel without his uniform. No photographs at the train station. No face for the press to print before he got there. An admiral's barge pulled alongside. He stepped down and looked across the harbor at what was left of the fleet. The rain was steady. The oil on the water was still visible. The masts of the Oklahoma jutted at angles that no shipyard ever designed. He said nothing for a long time. His name was Chester Nimitz. He had spent the 6 days since Christmas in conferences and briefings, walking the damage, reading the reports, learning everything that had gone wrong and everything that was still standing. Today, December 31st, was the official change of command, and what he did in the hours after that ceremony, nobody in Washington was expecting. To understand why Nimitz needed Layton, specifically Layton, nobody else, you have to go back 12 years. Back to a ship crossing the Pacific in 1929. The United States Navy ran a program that almost nobody knew about. Every year, they selected 2 naval officers, not the most decorated, not the fastest promotions, but the ones with a particular kind of mind, and sent them to Japan, not to spy, not to collect documents, to learn, to study the Japanese language from the inside, to live in Tokyo, to understand how the other side thought. In 1929, one of those 2 officers was Edwin Thomas Layton, 26 years old, Naval Academy class of 1924, 5 years of sea duty behind him on West Virginia and the destroyer Chase. On the ship going over, he met the other officer selected that year. His name was Joseph Rochefort. They were not much alike. Layton was sharp and sociable, the kind of man who could make himself at home in any room, earn trust without appearing to try. Rochefort was something else entirely. He worked at a depth that most people couldn't follow. He forgot to go home. He forgot what day it was. He was already half obsessed with codes and ciphers before the Navy ever pointed him at Japan. But they became close friends on that crossing. And in Tokyo, for 3 years, they built something together that neither of them had a name for yet. The Navy's briefing to new arrivals was blunt. Study the Japanese language. Stay out of trouble. Fail at either, and you'll be on the next ship home. So Layton studied. Not just vocabulary, not just grammar. He attended plays, he read newspapers, he sat through operas in a language he was learning 1 word at a time. He went to naval social events and listened, not for specific intelligence, not for secrets, but for the texture of how these men thought, how they talked about the sea, how they talked about the Americans, what they were proud of and what they were afraid of, and what they never admitted to either. He was learning how to think like them. 3 years later, in 1932, Layton came back to the United States with something that couldn't be put in a report. He knew the Japanese naval mind from the inside, not from reading about it, from sitting across a table from it. Rochefort went into cryptanalysis. Leighton went into intelligence work. Different paths, same knowledge, same friendship. They didn't know yet what they'd been building toward. In 1937, Leighton went back to Tokyo, this time as assistant naval attaché at the American Embassy. A step up, more access, more responsibility, and a Japan that had changed in the 5 years he'd been gone. In 1929, Japan had been a rising power with competing voices, some pushing toward expansion, others arguing for restraint. By 1937, that argument was over. The military had won it. The invasion of China was underway. The generals and admirals who showed up at official functions carried themselves with the certainty of men who had already made their decision and were simply waiting for the rest of the world to notice. The voices that had once counseled caution were still there, but they spoke more quietly now, and only in rooms where they trusted the people listening. One of those voices belonged to the man who was then Vice Minister of the Japanese Navy. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. Leighton encountered Yamamoto at official naval functions during his 2 years in Tokyo. In the autumn of 1938, according to his own account, Leighton attended a formal duck netting party, a kamorio, at Hamarikyu, a detached imperial palace south of the main palace grounds. The guests were strictly naval officers. Leighton was among them. Yamamoto was not a mystery at these events. He was direct in ways that surprised American observers. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as Japan's naval attaché in Washington. He understood America's industrial capacity in a way that most Japanese military planners chose not to. And he said, in settings where he trusted the audience, that a war with the United States was not a war Japan could win. Not because he was weak, because he had run the numbers, and the numbers did not lie. Leighton watched how Yamamoto moved through a room, how he argued, what made him stop and recalculate. The way a man argues tells you more about how he thinks than the position he's arguing for. By 1939, when Leighton left Tokyo for the last time, he knew something no intelligence report could contain. He knew what Yamamoto was afraid of, and he knew what Yamamoto would do anyway, once Japan made its decision. December 7th, 1940. Exactly 1 year before Pearl Harbor, Edwin Leighton reported for duty as Fleet Intelligence Officer, first under Admiral James Richardson. Then, when Kimmel took command in February 1941, under Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. It was the first time the Pacific Fleet had ever had a staff officer whose entire job, not a side duty, not an additional billet, was intelligence. From that first morning, Leighton gave his admiral a daily briefing at 8:15. Every day, never missed. He synthesized everything: intercepts, direction-finding fixes on Japanese ships, traffic analysis, diplomatic cables, attaché reports from across the Pacific. Then he translated all of it into something a fleet commander could use. Not raw data, not academic analysis. A clear picture of what the enemy had, where they were, and what they were likely to do next. A few miles away, Rochefort had taken command of Station Hypo, the Navy's Signals Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor, housed in a windowless basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters. His team called it the Dungeon. Every day, the two old friends from the Tokyo crossing worked in tandem through secure communications. Rochefort's team pulled meaning out of encrypted Japanese transmissions. Leighton turned that meaning into something actionable. The arrangement was close to seamless. Two men who had spent 3 years in Tokyo building a shared language for exactly this kind of work. It worked on one condition neither of them could control. It only worked when the enemy was transmitting. Late November 1941. Leighton stood in front of Kimmel and told him what he believed. War was coming within days or weeks. Not possibly. Imminently. The indicators were everywhere. Diplomatic code destructions, fleet movements, the entire posture of the Japanese military. He had been tracking this trajectory for months. Where would Japan strike first? The Philippines? Malaya? The Dutch East Indies? Probably in combination. He did not say Pearl Harbor. And he wasn't wrong to say what he said. He was working from the best analysis available, and it pointed east and south. The problem was not what Leighton was reading. The problem was what wasn't being transmitted. Admiral Nagumo's strike force, 6 fleet carriers, more than 400 aircraft, the most powerful carrier formation in the world, had left Japan and was moving east across the North Pacific under absolute radio silence. Not reduced transmissions. Total silence. The keys had been physically removed from the ship's radio transmitters. There was nothing to intercept, nothing to track, nothing to analyze. To every signals intelligence system the United States had, the strike force did not exist. On December 2nd, Kimmel asked Leighton directly, "Where are the Japanese carriers?" Leighton looked at his charts. The location markers for the carrier divisions, placed according to the last known intercepts, hadn't moved in days, because there was nothing new to move them with. For the first time in a year of daily briefings, Leighton looked at his admiral and said he didn't know. Kimmel absorbed that, asked a few more questions. The meeting ended. What neither of them knew, what Leighton would spend decades helping to document after the war, was that Washington held information that might have changed the morning of December 7th. The highest-level Japanese diplomatic code, called Purple, had been broken by American cryptanalysts. The messages passing between Tokyo and the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, including detailed reports on the exact positions of ships in Pearl Harbor, formatted in a grid that served only one purpose, were being read in Washington. None of it reached Kimmel. None of it reached Leighton. Washington had decided the field commanders didn't need it. On the morning of December 6th, signals intelligence indicated that Japan was destroying its diplomatic codes at multiple consulates, the clearest possible sign that military action was hours away. Kimmel was notified. The fleet was placed on alert against sabotage on land, not against an air attack from the sea. That night, the harbor was quiet. Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. Leighton was at home, 7:55 a.m. The first explosion came from the direction of the harbor, then another. Then the sound became continuous, overlapping, compounding, not stopping. The phone rang. He drove to fleet headquarters through streets where men in white uniforms were running toward the waterfront. The air above the harbor was already dark with smoke. He walked into the operations room. The map was still there, the same map he had updated every morning for a year. The position markers for the Japanese carrier force, placed according to the last intercepts he'd had. All of them wrong. Nobody yelled at him. Nobody needed to. He sat down at his desk. In the hours that followed, while the Arizona was going down and the Oklahoma was rolling over, Leighton did the only thing that was useful in that moment. He started building the intelligence picture of what had just happened, the size of the force, the attack vectors, what they had hit, and what they had deliberately left alone. The fuel tank farm, untouched. 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to run the Pacific Fleet for 18 months. The submarine base, untouched. The repair yards and dry docks, untouched. The carrier fleet, already at sea. He wrote it all down. He didn't write a word about why he hadn't seen it coming. He already knew why. and writing it down wouldn't bring anyone back. That afternoon, he put in his request for transfer to Destroyer Command. And he waited. December 31st, 1941. After the ceremony on the Grayling, Nimitz called his new staff together. They filed into the room, the officers who had served under Kimmel, the men who had watched the fleet die, and spent 3 weeks since then, wondering what came next for them. Most expected to be reassigned. Some had quietly hoped for sea duty, a chance to be useful somewhere, to outrun what had happened here. Nimitz was already seated when they came in. He looked at them for a moment, Then he said, "I know most of you here. We've taken a whale of a wallop, but I have no doubt of the ultimate outcome. December 7th would not be held against them. They were needed and must remain." He would hear requests for sea assignments, but certain key members of the staff he was keeping. In a very few minutes of speaking softly, one officer in that room later recalled, "Admiral Nimitz convinced all hands of his ability to lead us out of this." Leighton stood in that room and heard what Nimitz said to all of them. In the days that followed, Nimitz spoke individually with the officers he was counting on. When he sat down with Leighton, he didn't revisit December 7th. He didn't offer absolution or analysis or blame. He gave Leighton a job description that no admiral had ever handed to an intelligence officer in the history of the United States Navy. "I want you to be the Admiral Nagumo of my staff. I want your every thought, every instinct as you believe Nagumo might have them. You are to see the war, their operations, their aims, from the Japanese viewpoint, and keep me advised what you are thinking about, what you are doing, and what purpose, what strategy, motivates your operations. If you can do this, you will give me the kind of information needed to win this war. Not, tell me what the enemy is going to do. Become the enemy in your mind. Think what he thinks. Decide what he would decide. And tell me before he does it. That assignment could only go to one man in the Pacific Fleet. The man who had watched Yamamoto argue at a formal gathering in Tokyo in 1938, and noted every hesitation. The man who had spent 3 years learning how Japanese naval officers thought, not from doctrine, not from textbooks, but from the inside. The man who had gotten it catastrophically wrong on December 7th, and would carry that specific weight for the rest of his life. Nimitz didn't keep Leighton because he thought Leighton was blameless. He kept Leighton because no one else had paid the price Leighton had paid. And men who have paid that price don't make the same mistake twice. From that day forward, Leighton was the only officer on Nimitz's staff, besides the flag secretary, with standing permission to walk into Nimitz's office at any hour, day or night, without announcement, without knocking. If Leighton had something to say, Nimitz needed to hear it. Leighton later wrote that he wasn't sure, sitting across from Nimitz, that the confidence being placed in him was warranted, but the clarity of what was being asked, and the certainty that there was no room left in him for anything less than everything he had, fired something that he didn't have a name for. He withdrew the transfer request. He went back to his desk. The next morning at 8:15, he was in Nimitz's office. If this story is sitting with you, if something in it feels like it deserves more people's attention, go ahead and hit the like button right now. Not for the channel, for the man. Edwin Leighton never had his name in a single headline from this war. That button is one of the only ways left to say he still matters. The 5 months between December 31st, 1941, and the Battle of Midway were not months of recovery. They were months of hemorrhage. Singapore fell in February. 60,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered, the largest capitulation in British military history. Burma collapsed. The Dutch East Indies fell. In the Philippines, General MacArthur was ordered to abandon his men on Bataan and escape to Australia, leaving behind a garrison that would endure the death march. Nimitz fought a holding action with 3 carriers and not enough of anything else. He sent them on raids, the Marshalls, Wake Island, raids designed not for tactical effect, but to prove the Pacific Fleet still existed. And every morning at 8:15, Leighton was in his office. The briefings now were different from what they had been under Kimmel. Before, the job had been to track the enemy, locate him, count his ships, report his movements. Under Nimitz, the job was something harder and stranger. Nimitz wanted to know what Nagumo was thinking. What would make him move early? What would make him hesitate? Where his confidence shaded into assumption. Leighton had to answer those questions as if he were the man himself. The connection with Rochefort remained the backbone of everything. Rochefort's team, working around the clock in that basement at Pearl Harbor, was breaking deeper into JN-25, the main Japanese naval operational code. What they extracted from the intercepts went to Leighton. What Leighton knew about Japanese operational thinking went back to Rochefort. The 2 men worked through secure phone lines, sometimes multiple times a day, finishing each other's analysis the way people do when they've been inside the same problem for years. In March, Japanese reconnaissance seaplanes appeared over Oahu and dropped bombs near Pearl Harbor. Nimitz asked Leighton immediately, how did they get there? There were no Japanese carriers close enough to have launched them. Leighton had read something before the war, an article describing a technique for refueling float planes from submarines at remote atolls. He ran the geography. There was only one place close enough and remote enough to serve as a staging point. French frigate Shoals, 490 miles northwest of Honolulu. He told Nimitz. Nimitz sent ships. The Japanese submarine seaplane team arrived at French frigate Shoals and found American vessels already there. They canceled the reconnaissance mission and turned back. Nagumo's fleet would steam toward Midway without knowing where the American carriers were. In a battle where the side that sees first wins, that blindness would cost Japan everything. That piece of analysis, drawn not from any intercept, but from a pre-war article, and 12 years of understanding how Japanese planners thought, would shape the entire battle. By May, Rochefort's team had cracked enough of JN-25 to identify a major Japanese offensive in the Central Pacific. The target appeared repeatedly in the intercepts under the designation AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. Washington's Signals Intelligence Unit, OP-20G, believed the next major attack would come against Hawaii, the West Coast, or Alaska. The disagreement was not academic. If Washington was right and Nimitz moved his carriers to Midway, the approaches to the West Coast would be uncovered. If Rochefort was right and Nimitz didn't move, the ambush that could win the war would never happen. Nimitz went to Leighton. Leighton went to Rochefort. Rochefort's team set a trap. They had Midway transmit in plain language, no encryption, that the island's freshwater distillation plant had failed. Within 48 hours, a Japanese intercept station relayed the information to Tokyo. AF is short of fresh water. AF was Midway. Nimitz had his confirmation. He began moving his carriers into position northeast of Midway, where Rochefort and Leighton said Nagumo's fleet would appear. 3 days before the battle, Nimitz called Leighton in with Spruance. Raymond Spruance had been handed command of the carrier task force when Halsey was hospitalized with a severe skin condition. Spruance was a surface warfare officer. He had never commanded a carrier task force in combat. He needed to know exactly where to find Nagumo. Leighton spread his charts on the table. Spruance said what any commander would say. He couldn't plan a battle around estimates. Nimitz turned to Leighton. He said he understood they were asking the impossible. He said he needed Leighton to be specific. Leighton looked at the charts. He looked at everything he and Rochefort had built over weeks, the intercepts, the course headings, the timing patterns, the knowledge of how Nagumo had approached Pearl Harbor 6 months before. He spoke. The Japanese carriers would attack Midway on the morning of June 4th. They would approach from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees. They would be spotted approximately 175 miles from Midway at around 0600 local time. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Nimitz told Spruance to plan accordingly. June 4th, 1942. Pearl Harbor. The operations room. Leighton was at his station, 3,000 miles from the ships he had just helped position. The first contact report came in at 5:34 a.m., a PBY patrol plane breaking radio silence northwest of Midway. Many planes. Then 2 carriers. Leighton looked at his chart. Bearing, distance, time. Within 5 degrees, 5 miles, 5 minutes of what he had said in that room 3 days ago. He didn't say anything. He kept reading the incoming traffic. The reports came in over the next several hours. American dive bombers had found the Japanese fleet. 3 carriers struck within minutes of each other. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Each one a name on a list that had started at Pearl Harbor. Ships in Nagumo's fleet on December 7th. Each one burning now on the same ocean where they had launched the attack that changed everything. A 4th carrier, the Hiryu, fought back and landed 2 strikes on the Yorktown before American dive bombers found her late that afternoon. By the following morning, she was gone too. Nimitz sent for Leighton. He didn't say, "Well done." He didn't say you were right. He said one thing. "Well, Leighton, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off." Then he went back to his desk. Leighton walked out of the office. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He had been in that same building on the morning of December 7th, when the map showed everything wrong. He had been sitting at that same desk when the harbor was burning, and the markers on his chart pointed at empty ocean. He was standing here now, 6 months later, when the estimate had come true down to the minute. The distance between those 2 mornings was not luck. It was not talent alone. It was what happens when a man understands, in his bones, what the first morning cost, and refuses to let it have cost for nothing. He went back to work. April 1943. A message came into Pearl Harbor from FRUPAC, the Fleet Radio Intelligence Unit. It was one of the most remarkable documents produced by American signals intelligence in the entire war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's travel itinerary, complete, date, time, location, aircraft type, fighter escort count. A scheduled inspection tour of Japanese positions in the Solomon Islands, laid out with the kind of operational detail that only appears in a highly trusted internal communication. Nimitz called Leighton in. The question was not whether American P-38s could intercept Yamamoto's aircraft. They could. The question was whether they should. This was the question that only Leighton could answer fully. He knew Yamamoto, not the file, not the strategic summary, the man himself, from Tokyo, from those formal naval events, from the duck-netting party at Hamarikyu in the autumn of 1938, where Yamamoto had spoken about the United States with the frank honesty of someone who had stood in American factories and understood what they produced. Yamamoto was the most strategically sophisticated officer in the Japanese Navy. He had opposed the war with America. He had been overruled. He had then executed it with the cold precision of a man who had committed to something he believed would fail. He was also, for that same reason, a moderating force within the Japanese High Command, the man most likely to recognize when further fighting served no rational purpose. If Yamamoto died, the question was not whether Japan would fight on. They would. The question was who would fill the space he left. Leighton's assessment: no one in the Japanese Navy could replace what Yamamoto represented strategically. His death would leave a vacuum filled by officers with fewer reservations about throwing men and ships into positions that couldn't be held. His recommendation: take the shot. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid, 16 P-38s lifted off from Guadalcanal with long-range fuel tanks fitted to their wings. They flew low over the ocean to stay below Japanese radar, maintaining radio silence, navigating by compass and flight time alone. They found Yamamoto's transport right on schedule, over the jungle of Bougainville. The man who had designed Pearl Harbor died on the same island his forces had occupied. Shot down by the country he had always said Japan couldn't beat. Leighton never spoke publicly about what he felt when he learned the mission had succeeded, about the man he had watched argue at a formal dinner in Tokyo, about the cold logic Yamamoto had always carried, about what it means when a man is right about everything that matters, and it doesn't save him. Some things don't translate into a statement. The war ran for 2 more years. Leighton was at Pearl Harbor for all of it. Coral Sea, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Every major operation in the Pacific was shaped, at some level, by the intelligence picture that moved through his morning briefings. On September 2, 1945, Leighton was present in Tokyo Bay for the Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the Missouri. The man who had stood in that room on December 31st with a transfer request already written was watching Japan sign the documents that ended the war. He retired from the Navy in 1959 with the rank of Rear Admiral. He moved to Carmel, California, a small town on the coast, looking out over the same ocean where all of it had happened. Through the 1970s, as documents from Pearl Harbor and Midway slowly came out of classification, Leighton started writing, not to defend himself. He had made his peace with December 7th a long time ago. He wrote to document what had actually happened, how the intelligence failures had occurred, where the information had been, who had held it back, and why, and what it had cost the men on those ships to carry the blame for decisions made thousands of miles away in Washington. He blamed Admiral Richmond K. Turner in particular, the director of war plans in Washington, who had monopolized access to the purple decrypts and kept them from Kimmel. Leighton named names. He showed his work. He did it with the methodical precision of a man who had spent a career building intelligence cases and knew how to make one stick. He wrote for Kimmel, for the men on that dock, for all of them. He wrote for years. In April 1984, Edwin Thomas Leighton died in Monterey, California. He was 80 years old. His manuscript wasn't finished. His wife Miriam and his 2 co-authors completed it for him. In 1985, William Morrow published it. The title was 4 words, "And I was there." Not "I was right," not "I was wronged," not "Here is what I deserve." 4 words that are also the most precise sentence he could have written. He was there on December 7th, 1940, when he walked into his first briefing as Fleet Intelligence Officer. He was there on the morning of December 7th, 1941, when the map showed everything wrong and the harbor burned. He was there in the days after December 31st, when Nimitz told him to become the enemy in his own mind, and handed him a second chance that no one in Washington thought he should have. He was there in the operations room at Pearl Harbor on June 4th, 1942, reading the incoming traffic as his prediction came true, within 5 degrees, 5 miles, 5 minutes. He was there when they asked him whether to kill the man he had watched argue at a formal dinner in Tokyo. He was there, not on the bridge of a carrier, not behind a gun, not on a beach, in the room where the decisions were made, in the briefings where information became strategy, in the space between what the enemy intended and what the American commander understood, a space that, in the Pacific War, was often the difference between a fleet that survived and one that didn't. And I Was There was published after he died. He never got to hold a copy. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, if there's a photograph somewhere in your house of a man in uniform who didn't say much when he came home, there's a chance that some of what he carried, some of the weight that kept him quiet at the dinner table, was shaped by the work of men like Edwin Layton. Men nobody photographed on the day of the victory. Men whose names don't appear in the headline, because the headline is the battle. And these men were in the room where the battle was decided before it started. Leave a name in the comments. Your grandfather. Your father. Where he served. Just one line keeps that story alive one more day. Don't let it go quiet. The most feared admiral in the United States Navy is standing on the bridge of his own flagship. And he is weeping. Not from a wound. Not from bad news. From 5 words on a slip of paper someone just put in his hand. 5 words that were never supposed to exist. No admiral wrote them. No order contained them. They meant nothing at all. A clerk thousands of miles away added them to a message by accident. And they just stopped the most powerful fleet on Earth dead in the water. October 25th, 1944. 300 miles to the south, at that same minute, a handful of small American ships are turning to face the largest battleship ever built. No air cover, no battle line, no help coming. They are the only thing left between the Japanese Navy and 100,000 men on the beaches at Leyte. How the strongest fleet in the world ended up in the wrong ocean at the worst possible hour, and what those 5 words actually said, is something the official record came very close to burying. Let's start with the 2 things happening at the same moment. Aboard the battleship New Jersey, a man named William Halsey is frozen. His whole career, other men had learned to fear the look on his face. He was the admiral who ran toward a fight. Reporters loved him. Sailors would have followed him anywhere. He was the closest thing the Pacific War had to a brawler in a 4-star uniform. And right now, he can't speak. His hand is shaking. The paper is shaking with it. 300 miles south of him, off a spit of Philippine coastline called Samar, a young sailor on a very small ship is looking through a pair of binoculars at the horizon. And the horizon is growing towers. Gun towers. The tops of battleship masts, coming up out of the sea like a city rising where no city should be. The ships these men were standing on were not built for this. They were slow, thin-skinned, turned out fast and cheap, on the lines of a merchant ship, with almost no armor on them anywhere. They carried a few planes to help the soldiers ashore, and not much else. Nobody ever expected them to trade shells with the heaviest guns in the Japanese fleet. The men aboard them weren't legends. They were farm boys and clerks and mechanics who had put on a uniform a year or 2 before. They had trained to ferry planes and cover soldiers, not to stare down the guns of a battle fleet at sunrise. Most of them had never seen an enemy warship up close in their lives. This was the morning they would. They were never supposed to be alone out there, because the most powerful fleet in the world was supposed to be guarding the door those Japanese battleships had just walked through. And that door was standing wide open. So here is the question. This whole story turns on, how does that happen? How does the strongest navy on Earth leave the back gate unlocked on the single most important morning of the entire Pacific campaign? And who sent the 5 words that pinned its commander to the deck of his own ship while it did? To answer that, we have to go back a few days, and we have to start with a trap. Before we do, if you believe men like the ones on those little ships deserve to be remembered, take 1 second and tap the like button. It's a small thing, but it's part of how they stay remembered. Then stay with me. Because what happened next is something most people were never told. Here's why Halsey was 300 miles away. Somewhere far to the north, the Japanese had put a group of aircraft carriers out to sea. On paper, those carriers were the most dangerous ships in the world. Carriers had won every major battle in the Pacific up to that point. Sink the enemy's carriers, and you win. Every American admiral knew it in his bones. What Halsey did not know was that those carriers were nearly hollow. Between all of them, they carried barely the planes of a single American carrier. And the young men left to fly them had been rushed through training and sent out with almost no experience at all. They were not a fighting force anymore. The Japanese had run out of the young men it took years to train, and they knew it. So they took what carriers they had left, stripped bare like a lure in front of a hungry fish. It was bait, nothing more. And Halsey bit. A carrier was the prize above all others, and that's the whole reason he moved, for 2 years, in every major fight across the Pacific. The side that lost its carriers lost the battle. They were the knockout punch. An admiral who caught the enemy's carriers in the open and let them get away would spend the rest of his life answering for it. And it had happened before, only months earlier. In another fight, an American admiral had held his ships back on the defensive, played it safe, and let a Japanese carrier force slip out of a trap that should have finished them. In the wardrooms afterward, plenty of officers said he'd been too cautious. Halsey heard all of it. He wanted those carriers. He had spent 2 years wanting them. And he was not about to be remembered as the man who stood still while the last carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed away in front of him. So he made a decision. He took everything north, not just his carriers, his battleships too, the big-gunned ships that were meant to stay behind and lock the gate. His own officers saw the danger. Down in the task groups, commanders looked at the chart and understood what was being left wide open behind them. One of them tried to warn him the enemy's main force might still be coming for the strait. Halsey waved it off. He was already looking north, at the ships he'd wanted his whole career. And up there, everything was going exactly the way he'd dreamed it would. His planes found the enemy carriers and tore into them. Ships that had haunted the American Navy for 2 years began to burn, and slow, and go under. By any measure Halsey knew, he was winning the fight of his life. That's the cruelty of it. At the very hour his men to the south were being left to die, Halsey was standing on his bridge, watching a great victory unfold in front of him, certain he had made the right call. He had no idea. He was looking the wrong way. And behind him, the gate swung open. Back off, Samar. The range was still closing. The Japanese guns had not opened up yet, but the towers on the horizon were taller now, closer. And the men on those little ships were beginning to understand that no one was coming to stand between them and what was out there. The open door had a name: San Bernardino Strait. It was a narrow passage of water that led straight to the American landing beaches, like a hallway that ran right up to a bedroom door. Whoever controlled that strait controlled whether the Japanese fleet could reach the invasion. For most of that night, everyone who mattered believed it was guarded, and that belief is the heart of the whole disaster. Because Halsey had sent out word, earlier, that he might form a battle group to cover the strait. He gave it a name. He listed the ships. Other commanders read that message and took it to mean the job was done, that a wall of American battleships was sitting across that hallway right now. It wasn't. Halsey had meant it as a plan he might use later, not an order he'd already given. But the wording was loose, and the follow-up that would have cleared it up never reached the men who needed it most. And there was something built into the American command that made the confusion almost inevitable. There were 2 American fleets in those waters that morning, and they did not answer to the same man. Halsey and his fast battleships answered to Nimitz, out in Hawaii. The smaller fleet closer to the beaches answered to General MacArthur, on a different chain entirely. 2 commanders, 2 bosses. No single officer standing over both of them on the scene to say, plainly, "You hold this straight." In peacetime, that's a line on an organization chart. On the morning of October 25th, it was a gap wide enough to sail a battle fleet through. So there were now 2 admirals in 2 different places, both looking at the same strait, both certain someone else was watching it, and nobody. In the dark, a powerful Japanese force under a commander named Kurita came back to that strait. Earlier in the day, American planes had hit them hard, and everyone assumed they'd turned for home. They hadn't. They'd only stepped back, waited, and turned around again. They slid through San Bernardino Strait in the middle of the night. Not a shot was fired. No one challenged them. No one was there to... By first light, they were exactly where no American wanted them to be, bearing down on the landing beaches, with only one thing in their path: those little ships off Samar. Now you understand why the horizon filled with steel, and why the men watching it were completely, totally alone. The men on those ships did the only thing they could do. They called for help. The messages went out in plain language. No code, no time to encrypt anything, because the men sending them knew that every minute mattered more than any secret. Their commander asked the question everyone was asking that morning, over and over, in words a frightened man could not soften. "Where are the battleships? Is anyone guarding this strait? We need help, and we need it now." Message after message. You can hear the clock in them, even now. The first ones are careful, almost formal. A professional asking a professional a question. Then the shells start landing, and the words get shorter, and the code drops away entirely, because there's no time left to hide anything from anyone. By the end, they are sending their fear straight out over the open air for the whole ocean to hear, and they no longer care who's listening. Help. We need help. Now. And those calls did not just go out to Halsey. They climbed all the way up the chain, across the ocean, thousands of miles east, to a quiet headquarters on a hill above Pearl Harbor, to Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz was the calm at the center of the whole Pacific War. He ran the largest fleet in human history, and he ran it by trusting the men he'd put in command, and staying out of their way once the shooting started. He almost never reached down into another admiral's battle to grab the wheel. That morning, he came close to breaking his own rule, because Nimitz was watching those desperate calls come in, and he could see something the men in the middle of it couldn't. He could see the whole board at once. He could read the reports from the north and the reports from the south side, by side, and the picture they made together turned his stomach. Halsey had gone north with everything. The strait to the south was screaming for battleships that weren't there, and the only ships standing in the enemy's path were the ones nobody had ever meant to send into a fight like this. A suspicion was hardening into certainty in Nimitz's mind. The gate had never been locked, and no one in the middle of it seemed to know. He did not want to reach down into Halsey's battle. He respected the man too much for that, and he believed in letting his commanders command. But he could not sit an ocean away and say nothing while the whole invasion hung on a question no one had answered. So he decided to ask a simple question. Just one. He wanted to know where Halsey's battleships were. He wrote it plainly. "Where is what? Repeat. Where is Task Force 34? That was the entire message. A worried commander, asking for a location. Nothing more. No anger in it. No blame. But a message like that didn't travel the way you'd think. To keep the Japanese from cracking American codes, every encrypted message was padded, dressed up at the front and the back with random, meaningless words. Nonsense on purpose. The real message sat in the middle, walled off by little markers so the receiving end would know what to throw away. The job of picking those nonsense words fell to a clerk. For the front of Nimitz's message, he tacked on the phrase, "Turkey trots to water." And for the back, something else drifted into his head, and he wrote it down. "The world wonders." He didn't mean anything by it. He said later it simply popped into his mind. And there may be a reason it did. There's an old poem a lot of men that age had learned by heart in school. A poem about a doomed cavalry charge, about soldiers riding straight into the guns because they'd been given an order and would not turn back. One of its lines runs close to those very words. And as it happened, the morning that clerk sat down to send Nimitz's message was the 90th anniversary. To the day of the battle that poem was written about. Maybe that's where it came from. Some half-remembered verse, surfacing on exactly the right morning, in exactly the wrong place. But he wasn't thinking about any of that. To him it was filler. Garbage words, there to be thrown away. The message crossed the ocean, and when it reached the New Jersey, the men there did their job. They stripped the nonsense off the front. Turkey trots to water. Gone, as it should be. But the phrase on the back looked different. The world wonders. It looked like it belonged. It read like something a commander might actually say. So the sailor decoding it hesitated, decided it must be part of the real message, and left it in. And that is how Halsey received it. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. Read it the way Halsey read it. To a proud man. In the middle of the worst morning of his career, it did not sound like a question. It sounded like a slap. It sounded like Nimitz himself, and the whole world behind him, standing in judgment and asking where the great Halsey had run off to while the enemy walked in the back door. Now go back to that image we started with. The admiral on his own bridge, the shaking paper, the tears, in his own words. Later. I was stunned, as if I had been struck in the face. He tore the cap off his head and threw it to the deck. He couldn't get words out. His chief of staff finally had to grab him and shout him back to his senses. "Stop it. What the hell's the matter with you? Pull yourself together." And here is the cruelest part. The message wasn't a rebuke. It never was. It was a scared friend 1,000 leagues away, asking a simple question, with 3 garbage words stuck to the end of it by a clerk who thought nothing of them. But Halsey didn't know that. For the better part of an hour, the most aggressive admiral in the Navy sat inside his own anger, arguing with a message that wasn't even an order. An hour, on a morning when minutes were lives, and when he finally pulled his battleships out of the northern fight and swung them south. It was the one part of the whole battle he'd spend the rest of his life wishing he could take back, by his own admission. Later. It was the only decision at Leyte he regretted. But by then the distance was too great, and the clock had run out. His guns would not reach the men off Samar in time to fire a single shell for them. The men off Samar were on their own, and they always had been. So this is the part the 5 words almost erased. While the admirals were tangled up in a message that meant nothing, the outcome of the greatest naval battle in history was being decided by a few hundred men on ships small enough that the Japanese didn't take them seriously. Look at the arithmetic for a second, because the men out there did, on one side, the heaviest guns in the Japanese Navy, battleships, heavy cruisers, a wall of armor and firepower built to smash a fleet. On the other side, 6 little carriers with thin steel sides, screened by a thin line of destroyers and even smaller ships. most of them carrying guns that could barely scratch the paint on what was coming. By every rule of war, it was over before it started. The man in command of that little group had a choice to make. And about 90 seconds to make it, he could run and be run down and lose everyone, or he could throw his smallest ships at the biggest guns in the world and pray it bought enough time for the rest to live. They should have run. Any manual in the world would have told them to run. They attacked instead. The little destroyers turned straight into the Japanese line and charged. They laid a wall of smoke across the water to hide the slow carriers behind them, and then they ran their torpedo attacks straight down the throats of Japanese battleships, close enough to force those giants to swing off course and comb the wakes. Every time one of those enemy ships had to turn to dodge a torpedo. It was a few more minutes. The beaches stayed safe. They fired everything they had at ships 10 times their size. And when the shells ran out, some of them kept boring in anyway, empty, just to make the enemy flinch. Even the pilots got in on it. The handful of little planes those escort carriers carried took off with whatever they had. And when the bombs were gone, they kept making dry runs at the Japanese ships, diving on battleships with nothing left to drop, just to make the gunners duck and the helmsmen turn. Anything to buy another minute. Anything to keep the enemy's eyes down. One of those destroyers was the USS Johnston, commanded by a man named Ernest Evans. He didn't wait for permission. He saw what had to be done, swung his ship around, and drove it straight at a wall of Japanese steel. He would receive the Medal of Honor for what he did that morning. He would not live to hold it. And here is where the enemy tells us who these men were. Because the Japanese looked through their own rangefinders at those tiny ships tearing into them, and they could not believe what they were seeing. Nothing that small should fight like that. So they decided it couldn't be small. They convinced themselves they were being attacked by fleet carriers and heavy cruisers, by a real fleet, because no other explanation made sense to them. They could not understand that all that fury was coming from a handful of the smallest ships in the American Navy. That is what those men looked like to the people trying to kill them. The line held. It cost us. Some of those ships went into the water that morning, and some of those men went with them, the Johnston among them. There is no way to tell this story, honestly, without saying that. But the beaches stayed safe. The invasion held, and the men who did it were not the ones with the biggest guns or the famous names. They were the ones nobody was coming to save. I've gone back through those after-action reports more than once. And what stays with me isn't the ships we lost that morning. It's that the men on those little destroyers never knew the whole battle had turned on 5 careless words. They didn't need to know. They just saw the horizon fill with steel, and they turned toward it. Now, it would be easy to end this by blaming Halsey. A lot of people have. But the truth is harder. And better. Weeks before any of this, Halsey's carriers had swept over these same islands and found them far weaker than anyone had expected. And it was Halsey who then pressed his superiors to throw out the schedule and move the whole invasion of the Philippines forward, to strike sooner, before Japan could dig in. They listened. The landings came roughly 2 months ahead of plan, and they caught the enemy off balance. That was the same man. The same restless drive that walked him straight into the decoy up north had, only weeks earlier, thrown Japan's whole defense into confusion. One instinct. It cut both ways in a single campaign. Nimitz understood that. He never publicly blamed Halsey for any of it. He knew what he had in him. As for the Japanese, their greatest gamble failed. They had gathered nearly every ship they had left in the world and staked all of it on one throw at Leyte. 3 separate fleets. A decoy dangled in the north. A knife aimed at the beaches through the back door. It was the whole Imperial Navy, all in, on a single roll. And when the smoke cleared, they had lost the largest naval battle ever fought. After Leyte, the Japanese fleet was never again a real threat on the open sea. The war at sea was, for all purposes, decided. And at the very moment, victory was finally within their reach off Samar. With those little American ships breaking apart in front of them and the road to the beaches wide open, Kurita turned his fleet around and sailed away. To this day, no one is completely sure why. But that is a story for another time. For now, come back to that bridge, to the cap lying on the deck of the New Jersey, to a great admiral, undone for an hour by 5 words that a tired clerk never meant to send, and to a few hundred men, 300 miles away, who held a line they had every reason to abandon, and never knew their whole war had hinged on a phrase from an old poem. 2 accidents met on the same morning, a message that said the wrong thing by mistake, and a fleet that walked through a door no one had locked. Either one of them could have handed Japan the day. Neither one did. Because when it all came apart at the top, it was the men at the very bottom, the youngest, the smallest, the ones with the least reason in the world to stay, who put their ships between the enemy and the beaches, and would not move. The brass lost the thread that morning. The men in the tin cans never did. The sailors who held the line off Samar are mostly gone now. So are the men who used to tell these stories at their own kitchen tables, the fathers and grandfathers who came home, sat down to dinner, and now and then let something slip that never made it into any book. If that was your father, if that was your grandfather, if you grew up hearing something about the Pacific that you've never seen written down anywhere, don't let it go quiet with you. Put it in the comments below. Tell me his name. Tell me what he saw and what he told you. Some of the truest history of that war was never written down at all. It was spoken across a table to someone who loved him, and it's still ours to keep. January 27th, 1945. 10,000 feet above Tokyo. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi rolls his Kai-61 onto its side and pushes the nose down. Below him, in a tight formation moving northwest at 220 miles an hour, a B-29 Superfortress is on its bomb run. He has done this before. He knows the geometry exactly, where the remote gun turrets can reach and where they cannot, the angles the gunners track and the angles they lose, the narrow window of sky above and behind the left-wing route where a diving fighter has maybe 3 seconds before the tail guns come around. He knows all of it. He picks his angle, nose down, throttle full. He does not fire. He does not pull up. He is 24 years old, the youngest squadron commander in the entire Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. His name has been in the Tokyo newspapers almost every week since December. Schoolchildren know his face. The Army has put him in for the Bukosho, the highest combat decoration Japan gives to a living soldier. His men would follow him into anything, and the only way he has found, after months of study, months of training, months of watching his pilots die working out the geometry of this problem, the only reliable way to bring down this single American bomber is to fly his own airplane directly into it. That is not a tactic. That is a confession. This story is not about what happened in the air on January 27th. It is about what Kobayashi understood on the way down, falling through 10,000 feet of Japanese winter sky, parachute open, the burning wreckage of a B-29 spiraling somewhere below him, and the rest of the formation, the other 29 aircraft, holding their course, holding their altitude, holding their heading. Not one plane peeled off. He had time to think. On the way down, he understood something about that airplane, and about the people who built it, people whose names he would never know, people whose names none of us ever learned. The order comes through on a Thursday. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi is 31 days from his 25th birthday when he is handed command of the 244th Sentai. He is the youngest man ever given that rank in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. The officer he replaces, Captain Takashi Fujita, is a veteran with years in the cockpit. Fujita did not fail. He was rotated out because the Army needed something different now. What was coming required a different kind of man. Kobayashi walks the flight line at Chofu on his first morning in command. 40 Ki 61 high-end fighters. The Ki 61 is a good airplane by any honest measure. Fast, solidly built. The only liquid-cooled engine in Japan's Army Air Force, which gave it a performance envelope that surprised Allied pilots the first time they tangled with it over New Guinea. It could climb. It could dive without shaking apart. Its pilots trusted it, which counted for something. He counts his men. Most of them are 20 years old. Some are younger. They came out of flight school in the last 6 months with 100 hours in the cockpit, maybe 120. In 1941, a Japanese Army pilot needed twice that before anyone put him in a combat aircraft. By November 1944, Japan does not have twice that to give. The 244th Sentai is considered, by the Imperial Japanese Army, an exceptional unit. These are the best home defense pilots Tokyo has. Kobayashi looks at them on that first morning and begins making a list of everything he needs to teach them before the B-29s arrive. Night formation flying. Coordinated attacks with ground searchlight units. The specific geometry of intercepting a very large aircraft traveling in a very tight formation at very high altitude. He does not have long. Everyone on that flight line knows the B-29s are coming. The Mariana Islands fell in July. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, all American now. Engineers are building runways on those islands right now. Runways designed for one specific aircraft. The math is simple. From Tinian to Tokyo and back is about 3,000 miles. The B-29 has the range. Kobayashi starts training the next morning. The Haiyan, the word means swallow, is a beautiful aircraft by the standards of its time. Its liquid-cooled engine gave it a narrow, pointed nose that looked almost European, which confused Allied intelligence so thoroughly that they spent months convinced it was a licensed copy of an Italian design. It was not. It was all Japanese, except for the engine concept, and in the right hands, it was dangerous. Kobayashi's hands were the right hands. He had been flying since 1940, started in light bombers, the obsolete Kai-32, which he flew in Hong Kong in December 1941, attacking British installations in the opening days of the war, then Manchuria with the 66th Sentai, then retrained as a fighter pilot in late 1943, then kept in Japan as an instructor. By the time he took command of the 244th, he had more hours in the cockpit than anyone under his command and most officers above him. He knew exactly what his airplane could do. He also knew what it could not. At the altitude where B-29s preferred to operate, 25 to 30,000 feet, the Ki-61's liquid-cooled engine began to labor. The thin air starved it. The supercharger worked harder. Power dropped. The aircraft that was quick and responsive at 10,000 feet became sluggish and heavy at 30,000, and the B-29 had a service ceiling of nearly 32,000 feet, above which Japanese fighters simply could not follow. The guns were another problem. The Haiyan's armament was calibrated for the kind of target Japanese pilots had been fighting since 1941. Small, fast, maneuverable aircraft that jinked and rolled and gave you a different angle every second. The B-29 did not jink. On a bomb run, it held its course with near-mechanical precision. You would think that made it easier to hit. It did not. Because the B-29 was not small. Its wingspan was 141 feet. A Ki-61's wingspan was 39. When you came at a B-29 head-on, the sheer size of the thing distorted every instinct you had about distance and lead time. And its remote-controlled gun turrets, 4 of them, operated by gunners sitting in pressurized compartments inside the aircraft, could track you from angles that no previous bomber had covered. Kobayashi studied the problem every morning before his pilots woke up. The radar stations southeast of Tokyo pick up the incoming formation first. 86 B-29s, coming in at altitude from the Mariana Islands. Their target, the Musashino aircraft engine plant on the western edge of the city. Kobayashi scrambles the 244th. They climb through broken cloud, engines working hard in the cold air, pilots scanning the sky. And then they see them. The formation comes in from the southwest, silver against the pale December sky, and large. Larger than anything the younger pilots have seen before. Several of them, in their cockpits, say nothing. There is nothing to say. The 244th attacks. In a single coordinated pass, the unit claims 6 B-29s down. The kills come mostly through ramming. Pilots who could not finish an attack with gunfire simply drove their aircraft into the bomber. All of the 244th's pilots who ram that afternoon survive. They bail out, land in the fields south of Tokyo, hitch rides back to Chofu. Kobayashi's own first confirmed B-29 kill comes that afternoon. The next morning, the Tokyo newspapers run the story on the front page. Heroes of the capital, the 244th Sentai, defenders of Tokyo, Captain Kobayashi and his young eagles. He reads the article at his desk at Chofu. He sets it down. He picks up his pen and begins writing his after-action report, the real one, the one that will go to Army Air Headquarters rather than the newspapers. He writes down what his pilots actually encountered. He writes down the altitude problem. He writes down what the remote turrets did to the attack angles he had spent 2 months perfecting. He writes down the number of conventional gunnery passes that produced confirmed kills versus the number that did not. He writes down the ramming numbers, how many kills, how many aircraft lost, how many pilots recovered. Then he writes down the ratio. He sits with that number for a while. Outside, his pilots are running maintenance checks on whatever aircraft came back airworthy. The damaged ones sit at the far end of the flight line. A few are past repair. Tomorrow there will be more B-29s. There are always more B-29s. First Lieutenant Isamu Kashid is already at altitude when the order comes through. Enemy aircraft inbound from the southwest. Multiple contacts. High altitude. He has been flying since before the war started. He knows every type of Allied aircraft the Japanese military has encountered in 3 years of combat. The P-40, the P-38, the Hellcat, the Corsair. He knows their silhouettes, their speed envelopes, their climbing angles. He knows what each of them looks like through a gun sight at 300 meters. He does not know what is inbound tonight. Nobody does. Tonight is the first time any Japanese pilot will intercept a B-29 Superfortress over the Japanese home islands. The Americans launched 68 of them from bases in China earlier in the evening, headed for the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata. The plants there produce a significant share of Japan's steel output. Bombing it is not a tactical objective. It is a message. Kashid climbs toward the reported position, and then he sees it. He wrote about what happened next in the aviation magazine Koku Shonen the following month. He wrote it the way a professional writes about his work. Precise language, measured tone, a pilot's accounting of what he observed and what he did. He is not trying to frighten anyone. He is simply describing what was there. He closed to within 20 or 30 meters. he wrote. And then everything became white. The fuselage of the enemy aircraft filled his entire gun sight. Every calculation he had ever learned about ranging, about lead time, about the angular dimensions of a target at a given distance, all of it dissolved into a single white mass that did not look like an airplane. It looked like a building that was traveling at 220 miles an hour at 30,000 feet above the island of Kyushu. He did not hesitate. He fired. The B-29 nosed down. A section of the dorsal fin came away. The aircraft began to fall. He wrote it all down in careful sequence. What he saw, what he did, what the result was. The piece reads like an after-action report, except for that word. White. A Kai-61. Haiyan has a wingspan of 39 feet. A B-29 Superfortress has a wingspan of 141 feet. At 20 meters, 66 feet, Kashid was closer to that aircraft than the length of its own wing. He was inside its geometry. He was not looking at an airplane from the outside. He was engulfed by it. The fuselage alone was 99 feet long, longer than a standard American house lot is wide. The 4 Wright radial engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, were individually larger than most Japanese fighter aircraft when you included their cowlings and propeller arcs. Kashid had been trained to fight things that moved like birds. Fast, sharp-cornered, reactive. The B-29 did not move like a bird. When it sensed him and began to climb, trying to gain altitude to escape. The motion was enormous and slow, the way a ship changes course in open water, a thing so massive that its movement happens in a different register than everything around it. He described it starting to climb. The phrasing is quiet. He was watching something the weight of 60 tons respond to the threat of his 39-foot fighter, the way a river responds to a stone. The B-29 was many things the Japanese military had no answer for. It flew at altitudes where Japanese engines lost power and Japanese pilots lost judgment from oxygen deprivation, 30,000 feet and above, where the air was so thin that a man in an open cockpit became confused and slow within minutes. The B-29's crew flew in a pressurized cabin. They sat in their shirt sleeves. They could stay up there for hours. Its gun turrets were remote-controlled. The gunners did not sit exposed in open positions where a strafing pass could kill them. They sat inside the aircraft, behind armor plate, aiming through optical sighting systems. You could not suppress those guns by attacking the gunner. There was no gunner to see. Its range was 3,300 miles with a combat load. From the Mariana Islands to Tokyo and back was roughly 3,000 miles. The B-29 could make that trip, drop 20,000 pounds of bombs on whatever it was sent to destroy, and fly home. Every one of those capabilities had a human history behind it. A decision made in a design meeting in Seattle, or a materials choice in a factory in Wichita, or a tooling innovation worked out by a machinist in Marietta, Georgia, who had never seen a gun fired in his life. The B-29 program cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers across 4 main assembly plants and over 1,400 subcontractors. At its peak, the Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, was completing 4.2 B-29s every single working day. Not every week, every day. The men and women who built those aircraft never left Kansas. They drove to the plant before sunrise. They drove home after dark. They worked 2 shifts, sometimes 3. They built something most of them would never see fly over anything except flat Kansas prairie. The people in those factories never fired a gun. Most of them never left the county where they were born. But at 30,000 feet over Japan, what they had built was more present than anything the Japanese military could put in the air against it. If this story is reaching you, if something in it is connecting to what your grandfather was part of, whether he flew one of these or riveted one together, or just worked a shift at a plant that made parts for something this war needed, hit the like button. Not for this channel. For him. He didn't get a headline either. Back at Chofu, after December 3rd, Kobayashi sits with his numbers. The 244th flew against 86 B-29s that afternoon and claimed 6 destroyed. The newspapers said the defenders of Tokyo had driven back the American raiders. The emperor's capital was safe. The 244th Sentai was the sword of Japan. Kobayashi's report said something different. 6 kills from 86 aircraft. Most of those 6 came from ramming. Conventional gunnery. The standard passes his pilots had been drilling for months, had produced a handful of damaged aircraft and very few confirmed kills. The B-29's structure absorbed punishment that would have torn apart anything else in the sky. Its remote turrets tracked his pilots through attack angles that no previous bomber had covered. The altitude gap, the difference between where the B-29 preferred to operate and where the Ki-61 could fight effectively, was not a narrow margin that training could overcome. It was a design fact. He filed the report. The newspapers kept running the headlines. Here is the arithmetic that Kobayashi understood and did not write down, because there was no point in writing it down. At the Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, 4.2 B-29s were rolling off the assembly line every working day. There were 3 other production plants besides Wichita: Bell Aircraft in Marietta, Georgia, Martin in Omaha, Nebraska, Boeing's own facility in Renton, Washington, all 4 plants running simultaneously. The B-29 program had already reduced the man-hours required to build one aircraft from 157,000 to fewer than 20,000. They were getting faster. The 244th Sentai had 40 Ki-61s, replacement parts for the high-end's liquid-cooled engine, the component that made it different from every other Japanese fighter. The component that gave it the performance Kobayashi depended on took weeks to arrive, sometimes longer. The engine factory that supplied the Ki-61's power plant was a single building in Akashi. One American bombing raid in January 1945 would destroy it entirely. Japan was not building fighters at 4.2 per day. Japan was not building fighters at 4.2 per week. In the arithmetic of 1944, every time the 244th rammed a B-29, they traded a pilot and an aircraft for one position in a formation of 80. The production line in Wichita replaced that B-29 in about 6 hours. Japan replaced the Ki-61 in weeks, if the parts came through, and could not replace the pilot at all, not with anyone who had Kobayashi's hours in the cockpit, not with anyone who had seen a B-29 up close and lived to teach the lesson. The ramming was not recklessness. Kobayashi was not sending his men to die for nothing. He had worked the problem from every angle his training and experience could reach, and ramming was the answer that came back every time. It was the rational solution to a gunnery problem that conventional munitions could not solve at the altitudes and closing speeds involved. A head-on attack against a B-29 gave you perhaps 3 seconds to fire before the turrets found you. 3 seconds at a closing speed above 500 miles an hour. The math on hitting something critical in 3 seconds was not favorable. Ramming worked. His pilots came back. Some of them, they bailed out, landed in fields, hitched rides back to Chofu, flew again the next week. The problem was that the math on the other side never changed. In the evenings, after the maintenance crews finished and the flight line went quiet, Kobayashi's pilots talked. They had all seen things now that the public had not seen. They knew what the B-29 looked like at 20 meters. They knew what the remote turrets sounded like tracking a Ki-61 through a turn. They knew that a B-29, hit hard, on fire, losing altitude, would not take the rest of its formation with it. The other aircraft held their course, every time. This is the detail that registered differently to a professional aviator than it did to a newspaper reader. A civilian reading the December 4th headlines understood the B-29 as a powerful weapon that Japan's brave pilots were fighting with great skill and sacrifice. That reading was not wrong. A pilot who had been at 20 meters understood something else. He understood that the aircraft's behavior under attack wasn't the behavior of something that could be frightened. It flew the heading it was given. It dropped the bombs it carried. It flew home. The men inside it were brave, but their bravery was not what kept the formation intact. The formation stayed intact because the aircraft made it possible to stay intact. The aircraft could do that because of decisions made in Seattle and Wichita and Marietta. Decisions about pressurization and remote gunnery and structural weight that had been worked out years before the first B-29 crossed the Japanese coastline. Kobayashi knew all of this by January. He had known most of it since December. He flew again anyway, because that was the job, and because he was the kind of man who did the job he was given until there was no job left to do. January 27th, 1945, was not the day he learned something new. It was the day the thing he already knew became undeniable. The scramble order comes in the late morning. 76 B-29s, inbound from the south, targeting industrial facilities in the Musashino and Tachikawa area west of the city. The 244th launches from Chofu. Kobayashi takes his position and begins to climb. He has done this 20 times since December. He knows the sound of his own engine straining against the cold air above 15,000 feet. He knows the way the B-29s look coming from the south. Silver, high, moving with the absolute indifference of aircraft that have already done their arithmetic and found it satisfactory. He selects his target. One aircraft, slightly displaced from the main formation on the left side. He has learned to look for the displaced ones, small variations in formation position that a formation leader might have accepted, but which create marginally better attack angles. He rolls and puts the nose down. What happens next takes less than 4 seconds. His Ki-61 strikes the B-29. The impact destroys his aircraft around him. He has one clear action available to him, and he takes it. He gets out. The parachute opens. He is falling through winter air above the western edge of Tokyo, and the first thing he looks at is not the burning wreckage of the B-29 below him. He looks at the formation. 29 aircraft. They have not changed speed. They have not changed altitude. They have not changed heading. One plane fell out of that formation, the one he hit, somewhere below him now, going down in pieces over the farmland west of the city. The other 29 are past him already, moving northwest, growing smaller. In a few minutes, they will be over the target. In a few hours, they will be back over the Pacific, flying south toward the Marianas. They will land on the same runway they took off from. The ground crews will count them. They will report the loss. Somewhere in Kansas, within the week, another B-29 will leave the end of an assembly line and be handed to a ferry crew. Kobayashi does not know this as a fact. He has never been to Kansas. He has no intelligence on the production schedules of the Boeing Wichita plant. He does not know the name of a single person who works there. He understands it as a truth. Below him, Tokyo, the city he has been defending since November. He can see it clearly from here. The Imperial Palace, the factory districts, the dense residential neighborhoods spreading west from the center. He has been flying over this city for months, and he has never looked at it from this angle before. From above, floating down in silence, with nothing between him and it. Above him, to the north, the last of the B-29s disappear into haze. He has been close enough to touch that aircraft twice now, once with his guns, once with his own airframe, both times. The formation continued. He lands in a field west of the city. Minor bruises. A farmer finds him first. Then soldiers. He is back at Chofu by evening. He is 24 years old. He will fly again. Kobayashi is not supposed to be in the air. The order from Army headquarters is to stand down, wait for the B-29s, not the fighter sweeps. His unit is needed for the bomber intercepts, not the Hellcats that have been ranging freely over the home islands since the American carriers moved in close. He watches Hellcats from VF-31 work over Yokkaichi airfield. He launches the 244th. What follows is a dogfight at what eyewitnesses describe as almost hangar-top height, aircraft turning and firing almost at ground level over the field itself. The 244th claims 10 kills. The actual count, from records on both sides, is 2 aircraft lost per side. Kobayashi lands. The court-martial paperwork is waiting. The charge is serious. Disobeying a direct order in wartime carries consequences that end careers and, in the Imperial Japanese Army, sometimes and more than that. Word reaches the Emperor. The Emperor expresses approval of Kobayashi's actions. The court-martial is dropped. He is the best pilot Japan has. He is 24 years old. He is being saved from his own chain of command by the Emperor of Japan. 3 weeks later, the war ends. The Imperial broadcast comes over the radio in the morning. Kobayashi is at Chofu. His wife Senko, who will write about this period years later, records that he went quiet for several days after the broadcast. He did not explain himself. He went quiet in the way that men go quiet when the thing they have organized their entire understanding of the world around has stopped being true, and they have not yet found the language for what comes next. He had taken command of the 244th at 24. He is still 24 when Japan surrenders. Between November and August, he flew against the largest bomber ever built, survived 3 bailouts, was decorated by the Army, and was nearly court-martialed by the same Army in the same month. In 9 months he had lived more of what his profession could offer than most men see in a full career. He had done everything his country asked of him. It had not been enough. He worked in the civilian sector for the next 9 years. He does not appear in the public record during this period. He was 33 years old, a man who had spent his adult life in cockpits, doing work in offices that history did not think worth writing down. The Japan Air Self-Defense Force comes into existence in 1954. Japan has no capacity to design its own fighters. The question of what the new Japanese Air Force will fly is not a difficult one. There is only one country in the world producing frontline jet fighters in sufficient quantity to equip an ally from scratch, and that country is the United States. The JASDF's first fighter aircraft are American. Its training doctrine is American. Its procedures, its radio procedures, its maintenance standards, all derived from the system that spent the previous decade building the most capable air force in the history of warfare. Kobayashi joins in 1954. He enters the JASDF Executive School and qualifies as a jet pilot. He is posted to Matsushima, then Suiki. In November 1955, he travels to the United States for 6 months of training on the F-86 Sabre. The F-86 is a North American aviation product. It was designed in California. Its engine, the General Electric J-47, was built by the same American industrial system that built the B-29's Wright radials. The same country, the same manufacturers, the same workforce of shift workers and tool and die men and women on assembly lines in the industrial Midwest. The man who flew his own airplane into a B-29 over Tokyo in January 1945 is now in a cockpit, powered by an American engine, learning to trust his life to it. And he is doing this because when Japan was finally able to choose what its pilots would fly, this is what they chose. He is not unaware of the shape of this. He died on June 4th, 1957, 36 years old. An accident, not combat. His wife Senko wrote about his life afterward, in a book she called Vapor Trail. He never saw 60. He had 1 year in that F-86 cockpit. 1 year flying an American aircraft on American procedures in a country that was rebuilding itself, in part, on the question of what it meant to have been on the wrong side of the thing that Kobayashi had spent 1944 and 1945 flying against. He understood something that the men who sent him to ram B-29s never did. The thing they built in Wichita was not a weapon. A weapon can be defeated. What they built in Wichita was a demonstration of what a country is capable of when it decides, at every level, from the general to the machinist, that something needs to exist and needs to exist now. That does not go away when the war ends. It becomes the world the war leaves behind. A lot of you grew up with a man in your house who didn't talk much about it. Your grandfather, your father, the one who'd set his fork down in the middle of Sunday dinner and go somewhere else for a minute, somewhere you couldn't follow. Somewhere he'd been that didn't have a name you knew. Maybe he said one thing, once, one sentence, maybe two. And then he looked out the window and that was the end of it. Some of them flew the B-29. Some of them built it. Some of them worked at a plant in Kansas or Georgia or Nebraska that made parts that went into aircraft they never saw. They punched a time card. They did the job. They drove home. They had no idea that somewhere over Japan, the best fighter pilot the Imperial Japanese Army could produce was falling through 10,000 feet of winter sky, watching what they built hold its course without them in it. They were just doing the job. That is what Japan's most decorated defender of Tokyo understood, on the way down, that Tokyo never did. The job was the point. The people doing the job were the point. If you have a story from that generation, one sentence your grandfather said, one thing your father carried home that he never found the words for, leave it in the comments. Not for this channel, because that story belongs somewhere outside of one person's memory. Don't let it disappear.